The room was bathed in a soft, golden glow from the lantern sitting on the bedside table. Jessy sat gracefully on the edge of the bed, her posture upright and calm. Her white nightgown draped elegantly over her body, but it was the thing on her head that commanded attention. A massive black snake, coiled tightly like a head tie. Its body glistened, its scales shimmering faintly in the dim light. Its head rested squarely on her forehead, yellow eyes glowing faintly, unblinking and eerily still. Jessy didn't flinch, didn't seem uncomfortable. In fact, her expression was serene, almost content, as if the snake were nothing out of the ordinary. Pastor Richard stepped into the room. It was the first night of their wedding, his face lit with anticipation to be with his gorgeous wife. But the moment his eyes fell on her, his breath caught in his throat, his legs froze mid-step, and a chill ran down his spine. There it was, a snake, tied like a crown on his wife's head. It looked alive yet unmoving, a sinister presence that filled the room with an oppressive weight. "Jessy!" Richard's voice came out in a shaky whisper, his eyes wide with terror. "What? What is that on your head?" Jessy turned her gaze to him slowly, her lips curling into a soft smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "What do you mean, my love?" she asked, her tone gentle and innocent. "The snake!" he shouted, stumbling backward until his back hit the doorframe. His hand trembled as he pointed at her. "There's a snake! On your head!" Jessy's smile didn't falter. She tilted her head slightly, her fingers brushing the edge of the serpent's tail as if it were a precious adornment. "You're seeing things, Richard. Calm down. There's nothing to fear." "Nothing to fear?" Richard's voice cracked with disbelief. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. "Jessy, there's a living snake tied around your head like a crown. You're sitting there as if it's normal." Jessy's eyes glinted, but her expression remained calm. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate and measured. "Richard," she said softly, her voice almost hypnotic, "this is our wedding night. Don't let fear ruin what should be a beautiful beginning." Richard's knees buckled. Then he gathered enough courage to zoom out of the room. But how did it begin? How does a man of God, known for his faith and wisdom, find himself bound to a woman with a serpent coiled around her head? All right, friends, before we continue the story, could you please subscribe to my channel, like this video, and tell us where you are watching from? God bless you for your support and make all your desires come to pass. Few years earlier, the church hall was packed to the brim, filled with men, women, and children eager to witness a historic moment. The Arise Gospel Church in Ibugwa, Region 12, was abuzz with excitement. Today they would welcome their new pastor, a young man whose reputation for integrity, generosity, and devotion to God preceded him. Pastor Richard stood at the pulpit, his head slightly bowed in humility as the church leader announced his appointment. He was a handsome young man, always dressed elegantly, that added to his dignified yet approachable demeanor. His smooth, dark skin glowed under the soft lights, and his calm but firm voice had a way of commanding attention and respect. As the leader finished his speech, thunderous applause erupted from the congregation. Whispers spread quickly among the crowd. "He's so young and dedicated. Can you believe he donated the new choir instruments himself?" But it wasn't just his devotion to the church that captured the hearts of many. Pastor Richard's charm and looks didn't go unnoticed. Young women in the congregation often found themselves staring a little too long, and even married women whispered about how fortunate his future wife would be. "Imagine being the woman who gets to marry him," one young lady whispered to her friend. "Forget it," her friend replied, rolling her eyes. "He's too focused on God to notice anyone." When his appointment was announced, no one was surprised. The congregation rose to their feet, clapping and cheering as the senior pastor laid hands on him. Pastor Richard knelt, tears streaming down his face as the weight of his new role settled on his shoulders. After the service, he greeted the church members with his usual warmth. Women lined up to congratulate him, some shyly extending their hands while others boldly offered compliments. "Pastor, God bless you. We're lucky to have you. May your ministry bring even more blessings to this region." Richard nodded graciously, his mind already racing with plans for the branch's growth. His passion was clear. He was determined to make the Ibugwa region a beacon of light and one of the largest regions in the state. Little did Pastor Richard know, his path of righteousness and devotion would soon lead him into a storm he never anticipated. Months after Pastor Richard's appointment, the excitement surrounding his leadership had started to fade. Each Sunday, he noticed fewer faces in the pews. The once vibrant choir sang to rows of empty chairs, and the sound of children laughing after service had grown quieter. Pastor Richard couldn't ignore the signs. His church was struggling. Donations were declining, and the few remaining members seemed distracted and unmotivated. He did everything he could, organized prayer vigils, held outreach programs, and visited members in their homes. But nothing worked. Meanwhile, news of Pastor Sylvester's growing church buzzed through the town. People spoke in awe of his ministry. "Did you hear? Pastor Sylvester healed a blind man last week. They say he saw a vision and prophesied someone's promotion. It came true the very next day. His church is packed every Sunday. People are even standing outside." Pastor Richard couldn't help but feel a sting of envy. Sylvester had been a friend and fellow seminary student, and they had once shared dreams of transforming lives through God's work. But while Richard struggled to keep his flock together, Sylvester's ministry seemed unstoppable. One day, after much internal debate, Pastor Richard decided to visit his old friend. As he approached Sylvester's church, he was taken aback by the sight. The churchyard was overflowing with people, some sitting on benches under the trees, others standing in small groups, chatting animatedly. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The choir sang with a power that seemed to shake the walls, and testimonies flowed like water. Pastor Sylvester stood at the pulpit, his voice booming with authority, his every word met with resounding amens. After the service, Richard waited patiently to speak with his friend. When they finally sat down in Sylvester's office, Richard struggled to hide his frustration. "Sylvester," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I see how God is using you in mighty ways. Your church is flourishing, and the miracles, they're undeniable. But I have to ask, how do you do it? What is your secret?" Sylvester leaned back in his chair, a faint smile on his lips. "There's no secret, Richard. It's God. He does the work. I'm just a vessel." Richard frowned, his confusion deepening. "But I pray, I fast, I preach the word. I've dedicated myself to this ministry. Why isn't God using me the same way?" Sylvester's smile widened. "Sometimes, Richard, it's not about doing more. It's about aligning yourself with the divine flow. Seek God, and He'll reveal His purpose for you." Richard left the meeting more troubled than before. Sylvester's words played over and over in his mind, but they brought no clarity. "Align yourself with the divine flow," he muttered as he walked home. What does that even mean? That night, as Richard knelt to pray in his quiet, empty church, his heart was heavy with doubt. Had he failed as a pastor? Was he lacking in faith? Or was there something else, something hidden, that stood between him and the power he longed for? Unbeknownst to him, his journey was about to take a darker turn, one that would reveal secrets, test his faith, and challenge everything he believed. It was a warm evening when Pastor Richard decided to visit his close friend, Pastor Sylvester, again. When Richard arrived at Sylvester's house, he was greeted by Sylvester's wife, who informed him that her husband was in the church, deep in prayer. "He's been there for hours," she said, her voice calm but tired. "He's preparing for something big." Richard, eager to speak to his friend and learn his secret, made his way to the church. As he entered, the hushed silence of the empty building seemed to heighten his sense of anticipation. He walked through the long corridors, his footsteps echoing, until he reached a small door near the altar, a door he had never seen before. Curious, Richard opened it and stepped inside, but what he saw made his heart skip a beat. Sylvester was standing by an altar, his arms raised high, chanting strange words in a language Richard didn't recognize. The air felt heavy, charged with an unseen power. The walls of the room were adorned with strange symbols, and at the center of it all, a small incense burner emitted a pungent scent. Sylvester's eyes were closed in intense concentration, his voice growing louder with each incantation. Richard froze in shock, his breath caught in his throat. The man he had admired for so long, the man who had once been his mentor, was not praying to God. He was invoking something far darker. Before Richard could react, Sylvester opened his eyes and saw him standing there, his face pale with fear. There was no denying the truth now. Sylvester had been caught. "Richard," Sylvester said, his voice faltering, "I never meant for you to see this. I didn't want you to know." "What is this, Sylvester?" Richard asked, his voice trembling with both fear and confusion. "What are you doing?" Sylvester sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I was desperate, Richard. I didn't know what else to do. I was losing everything. The church, my family. I was drowning in failure. And then she came to me." Richard's confusion only deepened. "Who?" Sylvester looked down at the altar, his voice barely a whisper. "Onye, the river goddess. She offered me power, everything I'd ever wanted. Prosperity, miracles, influence. All I had to do was accept her offer. She promised me that my church would grow, that I would be able to perform miracles like never before." Richard recoiled. "You made a deal with a goddess? A river goddess?" Sylvester nodded, his face etched with regret. "I had no choice. She told me if I didn't accept, my ministry would collapse. I was too weak to resist. And now, Richard, I am bound to her, but I have no regrets." "Take me to her," Richard said with a desperate look in his eyes. "I want the same power. I want my church to grow. Just like yours, not matter the price." Sylvester hesitated, then whispered, "She will demand that you be with a teen girl, at least once a month. It's the only way. You can't avoid it. It's part of the ritual." Richard's stomach churned. "A teen girl? That's a sin. It's wrong." "I know," Sylvester replied, his voice broken. "But it's the price for power, Richard. For miracles. For the anointing." Richard stood there, torn. He wanted to refuse, to walk away. But something inside him, his desperation, his fear of failure, began to overpower his morals. He thought of his empty church, his struggling ministry, and the success of Sylvester's church. The temptation to take the easy path, to finally achieve what he had longed for, was too strong. "All right," Richard finally said, his voice barely audible. "I'll do it. I'll accept the ritual." The day came when Richard, now bound to the dark pact, made his way to the riverbank with Sylvester. Onye, the river goddess, stood before him, radiant with a cold, unnerving beauty. She looked at Richard with piercing eyes, her voice like a melody that carried both allure and warning. "You've made the right choice, Pastor Richard. Now the ritual will begin." Sylvester, standing by Richard's side, gave him a look of grim reassurance. "This is the path, Richard, the path to power." Richard's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the gravity of what he had agreed to. But it was too late to turn back now. In the following weeks, Richard's church began to experience a transformation. More and more people flooded in, filling the pews to capacity. Miracles happened every Sunday, healing, prophecies, and strange anointed moments that left people trembling in awe. Those who Richard laid hands on fell to the ground, overwhelmed by the power that surged through them. As his church grew, so did his influence. He stood at the front, his once quiet prayers now charged with an undeniable energy. Yet deep within him, something gnawed at his conscience, a reminder of the price he had paid for this power. But for now, the miracles continued, and Pastor Richard's church was thriving. Members filled the building, eager for the next prophecy, the next miracle. They called him a man of God, a vessel for divine intervention. But what they didn't know was the darkness that lay behind the scenes, the unholy power that Richard had embraced to fulfill his dreams. Pastor Richard formed a teenage ministry in the church. Some leaders in the church frowned at it, that there was already a youth church and a children's unit, but Pastor Richard convinced them of the need for a teenage unit. Little did they know his evil plans. Over the next few Sundays, women happily supported their teenage children to join the teenage ministry. Pastor Richard took advantage, abusing at least one teenage girl or the other every month. He will buy gifts for them and invite them to his house to cook for him. After each episode, he will show them a golden ring and make them swear never to tell anyone. However, one day a new church teenage girl joined the church. Her name was Cindy. She was very beautiful and elegant. Pastor Richard was immediately attracted to her. He started inviting her to his house to cook for him. Soon, Cindy fell for his charms and gifts. Few weeks later, Cindy visited Pastor Richard. "Pastor, I am pregnant. I missed my time." "What? Are you serious?" Richard exclaimed. "Pastor, you have to marry me, after all. You are single. That is the only way my senior sister will not kill me for getting pregnant before marriage," Cindy replied. Pastor Richard couldn't bear the scandal. "Remove it, Sister Cindy," he said coldly. "There is no way. I will get married to a teenager. It will ruin my reputation." Richard pampered Cindy, who was already crying profusely. She cried and cried. Pastor Richard gave her lots of money to end it all. The next day she visited the hospital, but the process ended badly. Cindy bled so much when she got back home and died. Many months later, Richard had become more famous. One Sunday as he preached at the altar, Pastor Richard's eyes fell on Jessy during a Sunday service. She dressed elegantly and her beauty stood out among the chorus. She had joined the choir just a week prior, her angelic voice harmonizing beautifully with the others. She was striking, not just in beauty, but in presence. There was a calmness about her, an aura that seemed to set her apart. Over time, they began to exchange small pleasantries after choir practice. Jessy was always polite and modest, often speaking of her dedication to her faith and her love for singing. Richard admired her humility and felt himself drawn to her in ways he hadn't anticipated. Months passed, and their interactions deepened. Richard started to believe Jessy was God's way of giving him a second chance, someone who could truly complement him in his ministry. He proposed one evening after a church event, and Jessy, with a serene smile, accepted. Their wedding was a grand affair. Church members celebrated the union of their beloved pastor with a woman they deemed pure and virtuous. But as the festivities ended and the couple retreated to their home, Richard's life began to unravel. Then came their first night as a couple, with the mysterious snake. The following morning, after the horrible image of his beautiful wife and a snake coiled around her head, Richard avoided Jessy as much as he could. He spent hours in his study, praying and fasting, begging God for clarity. Was this a test, a punishment for his past sins? Or was he imagining things? Jessy, however, acted as though nothing was amiss. She went about her duties as a wife with grace, greeting church members who visited to congratulate them and preparing meals for her husband. But strange occurrences began to plague Richard's ministry. During his next sermon, he stumbled over his words repeatedly, unable to connect with his congregation. Members who usually hung on his every word began whispering among themselves, questioning his spiritual state. By the end of the week, donations to the church had dropped significantly, and key members of the board voiced concerns about his leadership. His ministry collapsed finally one Sunday when Pastor Richard tried to perform a miracle on a sick girl brought to church. As he prayed for the girl, she died. The story spread around the city and brought an end to his fame. At home, Richard grew more paranoid. He started seeing glimpses of the snake around Jessy, sometimes slithering out of her hair, other times coiled around her wrist like a bracelet. Jessy always dismissed his fears, claiming he was tired or overworked. One evening, as the weight of his collapsing ministry bore down on him, Richard confronted Jessy. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice trembling. "Who are you, Jessy? What have you brought into my life? My life has been a living nightmare since I married you." Jessy sat calmly, her expression unreadable. "I am your wife, Richard, the woman you chose." "No," Richard snapped, slamming his fist on the table. "You're more than that. There's something else, something dark. I deserve to know the truth." Jessy's eyes darkened, and for the first time her calm demeanor cracked. "You want the truth?" she asked, her voice steady but cold. Richard nodded, his heart pounding. She stood, her posture regal, and began to speak. "My name is Jessy, and I am Cindy's elder sister, the sister who loved her, raised her, and sacrificed everything for her after our parents died. She was all I had, Richard, all I had." Richard's face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. "I worked myself to the bone," Jessy continued, her voice rising with emotion. "I took on every menial job I could find, cleaning, washing, cooking, just to put her through school. I even gave my body to some men, just to take care of my little sister. I watched her grow into a beautiful, vibrant woman. And then she met you. Tears filled her eyes, but her expression remained hard. You ruined her, Richard. You used her and discarded her like she meant nothing. She came home broken, a shell of the person she used to be. She told me everything before she died. Everything! Richard staggered back, his legs weak. Jessy, I, I am sorry. I've changed. Change fire, repentance? Jessy spat, her voice dripping with venom. And what about Cindy? Did your repentance bring her back? Did it undo the pain you caused her? You stole her light, Richard, and now I've come to make you feel the darkness you left behind. You think you are the only one that can consult dark powers? Jessy continued. Richard, I know your secret, your deal with Onye. As Jessy spoke, the lights in the room flickered. The air grew heavy, and Richard felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The snake appeared again, slithering onto Jessy's shoulder and coiling protectively around her neck. I sought powers, Richard, she said. Powers to uncover the truth, powers to make you pay, and now you will live with the consequences of your actions. Richard's screams echoed through the house as the snake lunged toward him, its yellow eyes glowing. What moral lessons did you get from the story? We will love to hear from you.